Tonight, as you settle into the quiet of your room and let the day drift away, imagine we are stepping back tens of thousands of years into a world so distant and strange that it feels almost like another planet. A place where the air is sharper, colder, and cleaner than anything you've ever breathed. Where the night sky is thick with stars unspoiled by any hint of artificial light, and where the only sounds in the darkness are the sigh of the wind and the distant call of some animal moving slowly across the frozen earth. We are in the heart of the last ice age, an age where winter was not a season, but a state of existence, where vast walls of ice crept across the land like slow-moving mountains, their surfaces glinting blue in the pale sun, and where small bands of humans, both Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens, moved carefully through this landscape in search of the one thing that mattered most: survival. There were no stores, no fields of grain, no orchards heavy with fruit, only the hard and uncertain work of finding food in a land where plants slept beneath thick blankets of snow, and where the animals that roamed, mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, giant deer, and reindeer, were as dangerous as they were necessary. In your mind's eye, picture a small group of hunters wrapped in heavy furs, their boots made from hides softened and stitched with bone needles, moving quietly across a ridge of snow, their breath misting in the frigid air, their eyes scanning the white horizon for movement, knowing that each step must be measured, each decision precise, because a single mistake in this cold could mean the end. They carry long spears, tipped with carefully chipped stone, the edges bound tightly with sinew and resin, weapons that are the product of countless generations of practice and refinement. Tools made not for sport, but for life itself. They know the paths the herds take, the frozen rivers they cross, the valleys where the wind drives snow into deep drifts that slow even the strongest of animals. And they work together in silence, each person knowing their role in a wordless choreography learned over years of shared hunts. In the evenings, when the sun drops below the horizon and the temperature falls even further, they gather around a fire dug into the snow, the flames flickering against the fur of their hoods, casting long shadows on the icy walls around them, and they share thin strips of dried meat, passing them from hand to hand, speaking in low voices about the tracks they've seen or the weather to come. There is no rush here, no frantic clock ticking in the background, only the slow rhythm of survival, measured by the cycles of day and night, hunger and fullness, danger and safety. In this world, comfort is a fleeting thing. The warmth of the fire on your hands, the feel of fur against your skin, the momentary fullness of your stomach after a successful hunt. And yet these small comforts are treasured beyond measure, for they are rare and hard-won. As you listen to the imagined crackle of the fire and feel the weight of the fur blanket in this vision, you realize that these people, so distant from us in time, were not so different in spirit, that they too told stories to pass the long nights, that they too looked up at the same moon and stars, wondering about the patterns they traced in the sky, and that their hearts too must have felt the pull of home, however small and temporary it might have been. Here, in the stillness of the Ice Age night, with the snow hissing softly in the wind and the glow of the fire painting warm light on cold faces, we can rest for a moment, knowing that tomorrow the hunt will begin again. But for now, there is nothing to do but sit quietly, listen, and let the ancient cold and the deep time carry you gently into the kind of sleep that only comes when the world outside has fallen utterly silent. As the long millennia of the Ice Age slowly loosen their grip on the land, the towering walls of ice begin their slow retreat, not in a sudden rush, but in a gradual, almost imperceptible way, like the breathing of the earth itself. And with their withdrawal comes change. Rivers, once locked in frozen stillness, begin to flow again, winding their way through valleys where new shoots of green push up tentatively through the damp soil, and the air, though still cool, carries the scent of thawing earth and fresh water for the small, scattered groups of humans who have spent countless generations moving through this harsh world, following the herds and the seasons. The transformation brings with it possibilities that no ancestor of theirs could have imagined. Where once there were only temporary camps hastily assembled from branches and hides, now the idea of staying in one place long enough for roots, both literal and figurative, to take hold begins to flicker in their minds. Imagine a clearing beside a slow, shallow river, the banks soft with new grass, the water cold and clear, darting with fish, and here a cluster of families decides to remain, perhaps for a season, perhaps longer, drawn by the abundance of food and the shelter offered by nearby hills. Their shelters are sturdier now, made from heavier timbers and thick mats of reeds, with roofs weighted by stone. And inside these homes, the fire is no longer just a brief flare in the snow, but a constant presence, its smoke curling lazily through a vent in the roof. With the passing of seasons in one place comes the first careful tending of plants, perhaps wild grains noticed to grow better when the soil is disturbed, or patches of edible greens that thrive near the water's edge. And slowly, without any grand declaration, the first hints of what we would one day call farming take shape. Still, the old ways are not abandoned overnight. Hunting remains essential, and the men and women who have spent their lives reading the tracks of deer and the patterns of migrating birds still set out into the forest at dawn, moving with the same quiet skill their Ice Age ancestors honed in the snow. But now, they return to a place that is beginning to feel less like a campsite and more like a home. At night, in the warm glow of the fire, the talk shifts from only the next hunt or the next shelter to the seasons ahead, the best time to sow seeds, the signs in the sky that tell of rain or drought, the births of children who will grow up knowing this one place as their own. Over years and generations, these small riverside gatherings become more permanent, the shelters arranged in circles, the pathways between them worn smooth by countless footsteps, the shared spaces marked by hearths where the community comes together not just to eat, but to celebrate, to mourn, to tell stories so old that no one remembers who first told them. In the quiet of one of these evenings, as you sit with them in imagination, the sound of the river nearby and the faint calls of night birds drifting over the reeds, you might notice how different the rhythm of life has become. No longer the relentless push forward across strange landscapes, but the slow deepening of familiarity, the building of something that lasts beyond a single winter. It is here, in these simple, early villages, that humanity begins to shift in ways that will echo through all the centuries to come. Here is the seed of civilization, planted not in the walls of great cities, but in the patient tending of fires, the careful saving of seeds, the choice to stay when the instinct is to move, and as the stars wheel overhead in the same vast silence that our ancestors once stared into on the ice, you can feel the steady heartbeat of this new life, warm, constant, and quietly enduring. The slow settling of humanity into these early riverside and grassland communities did not happen in isolation. Beyond the familiar boundaries of each small cluster of shelters, other groups were making the same quiet choice, drawn to fertile valleys, forest clearings, or the edges of lakes where fish were plentiful and game wandered in from the surrounding hills. Over time, paths began to form between these scattered settlements, not deliberate roads as we would think of them today, but narrow tracks worn into the ground by repeated journeys. A hunter from one village might follow a herd too far and find himself at the edge of another camp where the people speak a slightly different dialect and wear hides decorated with patterns his own people have never seen. And here, an exchange might happen, not as a grand moment of trade, but simply as a practical arrangement. A bundle of dried fish for a carved bone needle, a length of cord for a pouch of seeds. In these small, almost casual moments, the roots of commerce take hold, not for profit, but for survival and mutual benefit. Yet with every exchange comes the spreading of ideas, a new way to weave a basket, a sharper method of flint knapping, the knowledge that far to the east there are stones that split cleaner, making better spear points. Gradually, the world of each settlement grows larger in the minds of its people, even if their feet still walk the same familiar paths between water and shelter. The rhythm of life remains bound to the seasons: spring planting, summer tending, autumn harvest, winter feasting and conserving. But there is a growing sense that the harvest is not the end of the cycle, but part of a larger, more predictable pattern. And with predictability comes planning. Storage pits are dug deeper and lined with clay to keep grain dry. Clay pots appear for the first time to hold water and surplus food, and the fires burn in hearths, surrounded by stones, blackened from years of use. In the evenings, people gather not only for warmth, but to work together on tasks that would have once been solitary: tanning hides, repairing tools, shaping new ones. And as they work, stories are told and retold, passing the history of their people into the memories of the next generation. The children listening grow up with an understanding of their place in the land, not as wanderers chasing the herds, but as keepers of a home that must be protected and nurtured. Still, the old dangers linger: a failed harvest, an unusually harsh winter, or the sudden arrival of strangers with less friendly intentions can disrupt the fragile balance. But the bonds between these villages, strengthened through years of shared goods and shared knowledge, make survival more likely than it ever was in the endless roaming days of the Ice Age. Now, in the quiet hours before dawn, when the mists rise from the river and the first light catches the ripples in silver, you can almost feel the hum of connection between these small communities, a network woven not of walls or armies, but of trust, habit, and the simple human instinct to share what we have with those we recognize as kin, even if their fire burns far away. This, more than the tools or the houses, marks the turning point in our story. The shift from survival through constant movement to survival through cooperation and exchange. A change so deep and so natural that the people living it do not know they are laying the foundations of a world that will one day span continents. As these small riverside and grassland communities became more settled, Another change quietly took root, the understanding that life was not only about food, shelter, and warmth, but also about meaning. When the day's work was done and the fires burned low, people began to fill the darkness with something more than the sound of chewing or the crackle of burning wood. They filled it with stories, chants, and gestures that reached beyond the visible world. Perhaps it started with the retelling of a successful hunt, the thrill in describing how the spears found their mark, how the animal fell, and how the village feasted. But somewhere in these retellings, the stories grew larger than the event itself, and soon they contained heroes, spirits, and unseen forces guiding the hunt. A great bison might not just be an animal, but the gift of a sky being, and a failed harvest might be the result of an offended river spirit. And so the people began to shape rituals to please these powers. By the riverbank at dawn, someone would place a carved figurine in the shallows, whispering thanks before the day began, or a hunter might tie a small bundle of feathers to his spear, believing it would carry the swiftness of the bird into his throw. Over seasons, these small acts became traditions, and traditions became ceremonies, gatherings where everyone participated, painting their faces with clay, wearing necklaces of teeth and shells, and dancing in great circles until the ground itself seemed to pulse beneath their feet. These were not just displays of joy or fear, but a way of binding the community together in a shared rhythm, of reassuring each person that they were part of something far greater than their own body and breath. The night sky, vast and mysterious, played a central role. Around the fire, an elder would point to the stars and tell how the spirits had placed them there, each cluster a sign or a story, each path of light across the heavens a message to those who could read it. The flicker of firelight on the listeners' faces would make the night feel like a living, breathing presence. And in that moment, the boundaries between the seen and unseen blurred. Dreams, too, were considered important. A vivid dream might be shared with the whole community the next morning, interpreted as a warning, a promise, or a command. And so, the people lived in a world that was not only physical, but also layered with meaning, where every rustle of leaves, every sudden gust of wind, and every shape in the clouds could be a sign. This belief did more than comfort them. It gave them a framework for decisions, a sense of control in an unpredictable world. It also made them careful. You could not simply cut down a tree without asking the tree's spirit, or take too many fish without making an offering to the water. Even the land itself became a partner in survival, respected and feared in equal measure. In this way, ritual and story became as necessary as tools and fire. They were the invisible threads weaving the people together, guiding their choices, calming their fears, and reminding them that they were part of a vast and mysterious whole. And though centuries would pass, and these rituals would evolve into the great myths and religions of the ancient world, their roots were here, in these small circles of light and shadow, where the voices of the living carried into the darkness, and the darkness somehow listened. With rituals binding communities together, and shared beliefs creating trust between neighboring groups, another quiet but world-changing force began to emerge. Trade. It likely began in the simplest way possible. One person had more dried fish than their family could eat. Another had beautifully knapped spear points, sharper than anything the first person could make. And so they met by the riverbank and exchanged, each walking away, feeling richer than before. At first, these exchanges were purely local, but humans have never been good at staying in one place when curiosity and opportunity call. So people began traveling farther to find rare things: obsidian from distant volcanoes, seashells from coasts hundreds of miles away, vibrant red ochre from hidden caves. Carrying goods meant carrying stories, and with every exchange came news of other lands, strange customs, and unfamiliar dangers. Trade networks formed like invisible threads across the continent, sometimes stretching farther than any single person could travel in a lifetime, goods passing from hand to hand until they reached places the original trader had never even heard of. These exchanges didn't just enrich lives with new materials. They bound distant groups together in webs of obligation and friendship, but also in rivalry. If one village controlled the only salt spring for 100 miles, they held a kind of power that could be used to demand better deals or alliances. And if another group blocked a key mountain pass, trade could slow to a trickle, starving communities of needed supplies. Out of these dependencies grew the earliest hints of diplomacy and, inevitably, conflict. It's not hard to imagine a meeting between two chieftains on a grassy hilltop, each with their best warriors standing behind them, discussing the terms of passage for traders, the division of hunting grounds, or the repayment of a wrong. And if those talks failed, the next day might see arrows flying instead of words. Still, most people understood that cooperation was more profitable than war, and so certain trade routes became safe corridors, protected by informal pacts or enforced by fear of retaliation. Markets of a sort began to appear, not the bustling cities we think of today, but seasonal gatherings where dozens of groups might meet in an open meadow or beside a great river, laying out their goods on hides or woven mats, the air filled with the smell of smoked meat, the glint of polished stone, and the murmur of dozens of different dialects. Here, marriages were arranged to cement alliances, disputes were settled by mutual friends, and young warriors measured each other with silent stares, imagining battles that might never come. Over time, these gatherings became events to anticipate, a break from the grind of survival, a time to see relatives from distant camps, to hear songs from lands beyond the horizon, to taste foods you'd never find at home. Trade was no longer just about survival. It was about connection, and in that connection lay the seeds of something entirely new, a larger sense of identity, where a person could belong not only to their family or village, but to a whole region, bound by shared goods, shared stories, and shared interests. And while the weapons and tools grew sharper, so did human ambitions. People began to realize that if you could control the flow of trade, you could shape the fate of entire communities. It was the first glimmer of politics, and it would not be long before the balance between cooperation and competition tipped into something far more organized and far more dangerous. As trade wove its invisible web between communities, the need for someone to manage these delicate relationships became undeniable. Every group had its natural leaders, perhaps a hunter whose skill put food on every table, or an elder whose wisdom kept feuds from erupting into bloodshed. But with goods, alliances, and rivalries stretching beyond the horizon, leadership began to shift from purely local survival to broader negotiation and coordination. These were the proto-chiefs, not yet kings in the sense we think of, but individuals with enough influence to speak for their people and enough charisma to convince others to listen. Leadership in these early days wasn't inherited through bloodlines alone. It was earned through a balance of strength, generosity, and cunning. The best leaders could settle disputes with words rather than weapons, ensuring trade flowed and alliances held, because a dead trading partner was far less useful than a living one. But with leadership came responsibility, and with responsibility came the need for resources. Resources that were often gathered through tribute, a polite word for what was essentially a tax. A family might offer a portion of their dried meat or their best tools to the leader, not as payment, but as a show of loyalty, knowing that in times of crisis, the leader's stored wealth could be redistributed to keep the group alive. Over time, this system deepened. Leaders began to surround themselves with trusted companions, warriors who could enforce decisions, messengers who could carry orders between camps, and even skilled artisans whose work could be given as diplomatic gifts. These early forms of political structure laid the groundwork for something larger, organized governance. Once power was centralized, even loosely, leaders could begin to plan not just for the next hunt or season, but for years ahead, deciding where to build semi-permanent camps, when to move herds to safer pastures, or which trade routes to protect at all costs. Yet, centralization of power brought its own shadows. Not all leaders ruled with fairness, and the temptation to hoard wealth or use warriors to intimidate rivals sometimes tipped the balance from respected leadership into outright dominance. Such abuses could spark rebellion, forcing groups to fracture, new alliances to form, and the cycle to repeat. Still, despite the risks, humans seemed drawn to this arrangement because it allowed for larger, more complex societies to form, once capable of building monumental hunting traps, coordinating massive seasonal gatherings, and defending their territory against outside threats. And with leadership came the first faint outlines of laws, unspoken at first, then gradually codified into shared customs. Which disputes could be settled with payment, which demanded exile, and which could only be answered with blood. Every decision, every alliance, every law etched into the collective memory of the people, passed down by storytellers who served as both historians and moral guides. And while these leaders could not yet imagine cities, armies, or empires, they had already set humanity on a path where the fates of thousands could hinge on the will of a single person, a path that would, in time, lead to both civilization's greatest achievements and its darkest catastrophes. The transition from a life of constant movement to one rooted in place did not happen overnight. For countless generations, the rhythm of human existence was tied to the migration of herds, the turning of seasons, and the constant search for safe shelter and fresh water. But gradually, something began to change. Certain places offered such consistent abundance that leaving them no longer seemed necessary. A river bend teeming with fish year-round, a valley where wild grains grew thick and ripe without much coaxing, a stretch of land where herds predictably passed within striking distance every season. These oases of reliability became magnets for repeated gatherings, and soon the camps built there grew sturdier, their hearths more permanent, their walls more resistant to wind and rain. Over time, people began experimenting with the plants they foraged, scattering seeds near their camps, noticing that the next season, food grew closer to home. A small convenience at first, but one that carried enormous implications. The early stirrings of agriculture were not yet full-scale farming, but they hinted at a different kind of future, one where survival depended less on the chase and more on the cultivation of a known landscape. As camps expanded into semi-permanent settlements, structures evolved from simple windbreaks and hide shelters into more durable constructions, frames of wood or bone covered in thatch, clay, or even mud brick in some regions. These were not only homes, but also storage spaces, because with permanence came surplus, and with surplus came the need to protect it from animals, weather, and inevitably other humans. Granaries emerged in their earliest forms, pits lined with stone or woven mats, carefully sealed against moisture, hiding precious stores of seeds and dried meat. The social structure shifted as well. Not everyone needed to hunt every day when food could be gathered and stored, freeing some to focus on tool making, weaving, or tending to small patches of cultivated plants. Trade became more intricate, no longer just the exchange of meat for hides, but of crafted goods for resources not found locally. Pottery appeared in some regions, first as a convenient way to cook and store food, but soon evolving into an art form, decorated with patterns that told stories or marked ownership. With the rise of settlements, territorial boundaries began to solidify. The land around a village was not just a hunting ground anymore. It was an extension of the community's survival plan, and defending it became a collective duty. This, in turn, spurred the development of early defensive works, ditches, walls of piled stones, or rings of sharpened stakes, to deter both predators and raiders. But the shift to settlement life was not without its costs. Where once small mobile bands could move away from conflict, now disputes had to be resolved within the confines of a shared space. Disease spread more easily in close quarters, and dependence on a single location meant that famine could strike hard if a harvest failed or herds changed their patterns. Still, the advantages outweighed the risks for many groups, and slowly but surely, humanity was trading the endless road for the rooted hearth, setting the stage for the rise of true villages and eventually cities that would change the course of history forever. As villages matured into thriving hubs of human activity, they became more than just clusters of dwellings. They turned into the beating hearts of early civilization, where survival intertwined with culture, belief, and ambition. The constant presence of neighbors meant that shared tasks could be organized with greater efficiency. Irrigation ditches carved by coordinated hands, communal granaries filled through collective harvests, and watchtowers manned in shifts to guard against predators and rival groups. The predictable food supply allowed populations to grow, and with more people came greater specialization. Some individuals devoted themselves entirely to crafting tools sharper than any before, weaving cloth finer and stronger, or shaping clay into vessels that were not only functional, but beautiful, bearing intricate designs that reflected shared myths or marked clan identity. Religion began to weave itself into the fabric of daily life, as the forces of nature, the sun that warmed the crops, the rain that nourished them, the river that sustained life, were seen as powers to be respected, appeased, and perhaps influenced through ritual. Small shrines arose within settlements, simple stone altars, or carved totems where offerings of grain, meat, or crafted goods were left to honor unseen protectors. Seasonal festivals emerged, tying the community together in shared celebrations of planting, harvest, and the turning of the year. Trade extended beyond the village, with merchants or envoys traveling to neighboring settlements, carrying woven baskets filled with surplus grain, crafted tools, or decorative shells from distant shores, and returning with obsidian, salt, or precious pigments. Each journey broadening the horizons of the people and bringing stories of lands and customs beyond their own. Language flourished in this interconnected world, growing richer and more complex as it was used not only to convey daily needs, but also to tell histories, teach skills, and pass down traditions. With trade and contact came the exchange of ideas, a new method of weaving, a more efficient plow, a better design for a shelter. Innovations spread from one community to the next, slowly raising the overall level of knowledge and skill. The structure of leadership shifted as well, where once decisions might have been made by the strongest hunter or the eldest member, now councils, chiefs, or even early monarchs arose, their authority rooted in their ability to organize labor, resolve disputes, and ensure the prosperity of the whole settlement. However, the wealth and resources that came with success also drew danger, as raids became more organized and disputes over land and water grew sharper. Thus, the defensive structures that once served only to keep out wild animals were reinforced to withstand human attackers. Palisades of wood, walls of stone, and watchtowers that loomed over the surrounding fields. Yet even in the shadow of these defenses, life thrived. Children played in the dusty lanes between homes. Artisans hammered, carved, and wove in workshops that smelled of wood smoke and fresh clay. And elders recounted tales of heroic ancestors to wide-eyed listeners under the glow of firelight. Step by step, these villages were no longer simply surviving. They were shaping identities, fostering shared culture, and laying the cornerstones for the great cities and civilizations that would rise in the centuries to come. As villages matured into complex settlements, their ambitions began to stretch far beyond the boundaries of their surrounding fields and rivers. A desire for greater security, influence, and prosperity gave birth to alliances, agreements sealed not with ink and paper, but with shared meals, exchanged daughters, and promises sworn under the watchful gaze of ancestral spirits. Neighboring villages would unite in times of need, sending warriors and resources to aid one another against common threats. And over time, these loose bonds hardened into permanent unions, the first sparks of what we might call a kingdom. The leadership of such alliances often fell to the most charismatic or militarily capable figure, a chief whose authority was no longer bound to a single settlement, but who could command the loyalty of thousands spread across valleys and plains. With this broader power came new responsibilities, ensuring safe trade routes between villages, standardizing measurements for fair exchange, and even mediating disputes that stretched across entire regions. Yet the rewards were equally great. Surplus harvests from one area could be sent to feed another struck by drought. Raw materials like flint, copper, or timber could be pooled and redistributed where most needed, and the combined labor force of multiple communities could build projects of unprecedented scale, from long defensive walls to grand ceremonial centers that stood as symbols of unity. Religion, too, evolved to meet this new scale of human organization. Local spirits were elevated into greater deities, shared across multiple communities, their temples larger and more elaborate, staffed by priests who acted not only as spiritual guides but as advisors to rulers. Festivals became grander, attracting people from far and wide, their marketplaces bursting with goods from distant lands, bright fabrics dyed with exotic plants, beads carved from rare stones, and tools forged from metals that gleamed in the sun. Yet power always cast a shadow. Rival alliances clashed for dominance, their battles fought with strategies that were becoming increasingly sophisticated, employing scouts, fortified camps, and coordinated strikes rather than chaotic skirmishes. Victories brought land, resources, and tribute from the defeated, while losses could fracture kingdoms back into scattered villages. But even in times of conflict, progress marched forward. The need to equip and feed armies drove improvements in agriculture, metallurgy, and logistics, while the exchange of ideas between allies and even enemies introduced new technologies and tactics. Slowly, leaders began to envision something beyond mere alliances, a realm not held together by temporary agreements, but a lasting structure, a true state with laws, taxes, and standing defenses. It was in this crucible of cooperation, ambition, and rivalry that the first seeds of empire were sown, ready to grow into forces that would shape the course of human history for millennia. From the scattered alliances of villages and the rising kingdoms of fertile valleys, the first true empires began to take form, their borders stretching beyond the horizon, their influence touching countless lives across vast territories. In the hot floodplains of Mesopotamia, the Sumerians built cities like Uruk and Ur, where ziggurats rose tier by tier toward the heavens, each brick a prayer baked in the relentless sun, each marketplace humming with the voices of traders offering grain, cloth, metals, and ideas. In the green ribbon of the Nile, Egypt flourished, its pharaohs wielding divine authority as they commanded armies, organized labor for the building of temples and pyramids, and kept meticulous records on papyrus, records of taxes, harvests, victories, and decrees that bound the land together. To the east, the mysterious cities of the Indus Valley thrived with their grid-like streets, advanced drainage systems, and standardized weights, evidence of a civilization so organized it could coordinate the lives of tens of thousands with unseen efficiency. These empires were not merely political units. They were living organisms, with arteries of roads and rivers, hearts beating in their capitals, and voices carried by messengers, heralds, and scribes. Religion took on a monumental scale, with gods now not only guardians of a village's fields, but lords of sun, sky, and underworld, shaping the destiny of nations. Armies evolved into disciplined forces, equipped with bronze weapons, chariots, and tactics honed over decades of warfare, capable of both defending borders and projecting power far into foreign lands. Diplomacy, too, became an art. Emissaries traveled between courts bearing gifts. Marriage alliances were struck between royal families, and treaties were inscribed into stone to be witnessed by generations yet unborn. In this new world, the individual was part of something greater than themselves. Whether they were a farmer tending barley for the state granaries, a mason carving reliefs into palace walls, or a soldier marching under the standard of their king, yet for all their grandeur, these empires were fragile, vulnerable to the same cycles that had always governed human history: flood and drought, prosperity and famine, peace and war. Trade routes could be severed. Dynasties could fall to usurpers. Cities could be swallowed by desert sands or forgotten beneath the jungle. But each empire left behind more than monuments. They left ideas, stories, and systems that would echo through centuries. Writing that recorded law and literature, architecture that inspired awe, agricultural methods that fed multitudes, and myths that would be retold and reshaped long after the walls that birthed them had crumbled. And so, the long journey from scattered hunter-gatherers in the Ice Age to the architects of civilization reached its first great crescendo, the dawn of empires, a moment in time where humanity stood taller, built higher, and dreamed bigger than ever before, setting the stage for all the triumphs and tragedies yet to come. If you close your eyes for a moment and let the gentle hum of your own breathing fill your awareness, imagine drifting back to a time when the cold was not something you could simply turn away from by adjusting a thermostat, but an ever-present companion that shaped every choice, every movement, and every heartbeat. For the winters of the late Ice Age were a world that tested not just the body, but the mind, a realm where even the stillness carried a kind of weight, pressing down on the shoulders of those who dared to survive it. And yet within that quiet oppression, there was beauty, the slow swirl of snow across an endless plain, the soft crunch beneath carefully placed steps, the distant calls of migrating birds whose instincts told them when to leave and when to return. And in those moments, you might picture a small group of people moving together through this white, frozen expanse, each wrapped in thick layers of animal hide, faces mostly hidden, save for eyes that scanned the horizon for movement, eyes that had learned to read the smallest details, the tilt of a distant antler, the shift of shadow against snow, the way wind carried certain scents. And in their silence, there was an understanding deeper than words, for survival demanded a harmony of purpose, a rhythm where one step was echoed by another, where the crunch of snow underfoot became a kind of heartbeat for the group, steady, measured, unhurried. For rushing could mean mistakes, and mistakes could mean death. So they moved with patience, knowing that prey in winter was not easily found, and when it was, it would not be easily taken. But the hunt was not just about the moment of the strike. It was about preparation, the sharpening of flint points days before, the softening of leather bindings, the checking of spear shafts for cracks that could shatter on impact, all done in the dim light of morning fires, as frost crept along the edges of their shelters, and the children, too young to hunt, watched with wide eyes, learning not through lectures, but through the repetition of ritual, understanding that each small act, scraping a hide, stacking wood, tending to embers, was a piece of the larger story that kept their people alive. And so the hunters pressed onward, following trails that sometimes vanished beneath fresh snowfall, forcing them to rely on memory and instinct, passing through valleys where the wind funneled into sharp gusts, and across ridges where the view opened to miles of untouched white. And somewhere in the distance, a herd moved, their massive shapes almost blending into the horizon, until a shaft of weak sunlight caught on a curved tusk, and the hunters stopped, their breath hanging in clouds, knowing this was the moment to plan, to read the land and the wind and the behavior of the animals. For a careless approach could send the herd scattering, or worse, could draw the anger of the largest among them. So they spread out, each knowing their place, without being told, some circling wide to flank, others finding cover behind snow-laden shrubs, the air so still they could hear the faint thump of the animals' steps through the ground. And when at last the signal was given, not a shout, but a barely perceptible movement of the hand, they advanced, slow at first, then quicker, as the distance closed, spears raised, the silence breaking into a sudden rush of motion and sound, the startled trumpeting of the mammoths, the pounding of hooves and feet on frozen ground, the shouts now rising as the hunters drove their targets toward a natural depression, where deep snow waited to slow them, and the first spear flew, striking with a muffled thud, and the others followed, the air thick with effort and cold, until at last the great beast fell, its breath steaming in great clouds, the ground beneath it stained dark, and the hunters stood for a moment in that silence that follows both triumph and loss, for the taking of life was never done lightly, even in a world where life itself was a fragile and fleeting thing. And so they worked, quickly, knowing that the cold would preserve the meat, but not deter the scavengers for long, carving with practiced hands, separating hide from flesh, sinew from bone, each part claimed for its purpose, for nothing could be wasted. The meat for food, the hide for warmth, the bones for tools, and even the tusks for carving, their shapes turned into objects of both utility and meaning. And when the work was done and the sleds loaded, they began the slow journey back, the glow of campfires flickering faintly in the distance, promising warmth, promising stories told in low voices while the snow fell outside, stories of hunts like this one, of ancestors who faced the same cold, the same danger, and emerged with the same quiet pride. And as they walked, the wind at their backs, you could almost imagine the whole frozen plain watching them, ancient and unchanging, holding their footsteps in its memory long after they were gone. The return to camp was never a simple walk. It was a slow, deliberate migration, a procession through the pale hush of winter that carried with it the weight of both accomplishment and exhaustion. Each sled groaned softly beneath its burden. Great slabs of meat wrapped in hide, bones stacked with care, and tools tucked away so they would not clatter against each other and startle the sled dogs or the weary hunters. The air was sharp enough to bite at any exposed skin, yet within that cold, there was also a clarity, a crispness that made every sound distinct. The rhythmic crunch of boots on packed snow, the low, steady panting of the dogs, the occasional groan of wood as a sled runner passed over a hidden patch of ice. Above them, the sky stretched in a seamless gray expanse, clouds moving so slowly they seemed almost frozen in place, and from time to time, a soft flurry would drift down, the flakes swirling lazily, before settling onto the fur-lined hoods of those who walked in silence. They followed a route their people had taken countless times before, winding between tall drifts and low wind-carved ridges, passing landmarks that had no meaning to the outside world, but held entire histories for them. A crooked birch tree, where a hunter once hid from a charging bison, a half-buried boulder etched with marks from stone tools long forgotten, a narrow stream that, in spring, would run with meltwater so fast and cold it stung the hands to touch. For the younger members of the group, these landmarks were like a map written in memory, guiding them not just through the land, but through the stories of their ancestors, each bend in the path carrying echoes of voices long gone. The sun, pale and distant, began its slow descent, painting the edges of the snow in faint gold, and the shadows lengthened, stretching across the white like fingers reaching for the night. The wind shifted, bringing with it the faint scent of wood smoke, a signal more comforting than any sight, for it meant they were close. Soon the low shapes of shelters came into view, half buried in snow to shield them from the cold, their entrances facing away from the wind. Thin trails of smoke rose from small holes in the roofs, curling into the dim sky before fading into the dusk. As they entered the camp, figures emerged from the shadows, their faces lighting with relief and curiosity. Children darted forward, their small feet leaving a scatter of prints in the snow, but they stopped short of the sleds, knowing better than to interfere until the elders had spoken. The hunters greeted their people with nods, their expressions a mix of pride and fatigue, and soon a quiet rhythm of work began. The meat was carried to a storage pit dug deep into the frozen earth, lined with stones and packed with snow to keep it safe from scavengers. The hides were hung where the cold air could begin to stiffen them before they were scraped and softened by skilled hands. Bones and tusks were set aside for carving, their future shapes already taking form in the minds of those who would work them. Inside the largest shelter, a fire crackled, sending a warm glow across the packed earth floor. The scent of broth simmering in a clay pot filled the air, mingling with the sharper smell of smoke. People gathered in small circles, speaking in low voices, their words blending into a gentle murmur that rose and fell like the breathing of the camp itself. Some tended to tools dulled by the hunt, carefully resharpening flint edges with slow, practiced strokes. Others mended clothing by firelight, threading sinew through thick hides, their hands moving without hesitation, guided by years of repetition. The elders, their faces lined with the stories of countless winters, began to speak, not in hurried tones, but in the measured cadence of those who know their words will carry far beyond the moment. They told of hunts in seasons past, of storms so fierce the snow blotted out the world, of migrations that followed herds across endless distances. The children listened wide-eyed, their minds weaving the spoken words into images more vivid than anything their eyes had yet seen. Outside, the snow continued to fall in soft, steady flakes, muffling the world until the only sounds were the low crackle of the fire, the quiet voices of the storytellers, and the occasional sigh of wind against the shelter walls. And so, the night deepened, and the camp became a small island of warmth in the vast ocean of cold that surrounded it. Each person knew their place, their role, their purpose, not because it was written or ordered, but because it had been lived and learned through countless cycles of survival. The hunt was done, the people were fed, and for a time, in this frozen age, that was enough. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, as it always did. But for tonight, the people rested beneath the faint shimmer of stars, their breaths rising in unison into the cold, still air, as if the camp itself was a single living being, holding its place in the silent memory of the Ice Age. Morning came not as a sudden burst of light, but as a gradual lifting of darkness, the deep black of night slowly melting into a muted gray. The air outside the shelters was still and brittle, the kind of cold that clung to the inside of one's nose and made each breath a visible plume, drifting lazily upward. Within the camp, life began to stir in unhurried rhythms. The faint creak of wood, The soft hiss of embers, coaxed back to flame, and the quiet rustle of fur blankets being drawn aside were the first sounds to break the hush. One by one, people emerged from their shelters, their fur hoods pulled tight, their boots crunching softly on the packed snow as they moved toward the central fire. The fire itself was small but steady, a patient, glowing heart in the middle of the settlement. Around it, pots were set to heat, sending up tendrils of steam that carried with them the rich scent of boiled roots and dried meat. The dogs, having rested well after their labor the previous day, paced in lazy circles, their paws making soft impressions in the frost, their breath rising in steady puffs. Children clustered near their mothers, their cheeks flushed pink from the cold, their small hands reaching eagerly toward the warmth. The elders sat a little apart, their eyes half-lidded against the pale light, speaking in low tones that carried no urgency. For in this world, there was rarely reason to rush. Tasks were chosen with quiet efficiency, each person slipping naturally into the role needed for the day. Hunters prepared their spears, checking each point for chips and testing the bindings of sinew that held them fast. Others worked at scraping hides taken from the hunt, the steady, rhythmic sound of a stone on skin like the faint beat of a distant drum. Women sorted through the stores of dried herbs and roots, setting aside what would be used for cooking and what would be kept for medicine. A few younger members of the group ventured toward the stream, breaking through the thin shell of ice that had formed overnight to draw water, the surface shattering with a sound like fragile glass. Above them, the sun rose slowly, its light filtered through a veil of thin cloud, turning the snow into a vast expanse of muted silver. The horizon seemed endless, broken only by the distant shapes of low hills and the occasional dark silhouette of a lone tree stripped bare for the winter. From time to time, the wind shifted, carrying with it a far-off sound, the groan of ice on the river, the cry of a bird searching for food, the faint creak of frozen branches swaying against each other. These small noises, so easily lost in a busier world, seemed amplified in the stillness, each one a reminder that the land itself was alive, even in the depth of winter. By midday, a small group was ready to travel, not for the hunt this time, but to check the traps set days earlier along the forest's edge. They moved quietly, leaving only a trail of soft prints in the snow. Their spears carried more for caution than expectation. The forest welcomed them with its own kind of silence, a heavy, hushed presence, broken only by the whisper of snow slipping from high branches or the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. In this place, time seemed to stretch, each step measured and deliberate, the world reduced to the crunch of snow and the steady rhythm of breath. Some traps held only drifted snow or curious tracks, where a small animal had investigated and moved on. Others had done their work, and these were emptied with respectful efficiency. The animal freed from its snare, its body wrapped in hide for the journey back. No words were spoken over the catch, but the group moved with a shared understanding that every life taken here was part of a chain far older than any one of them. By the time they returned to camp, the light had already begun to fade, the sun's pale glow sinking toward the horizon, pulling the temperature down with it. The fire was rekindled to a brighter flame, and the smell of roasting meat mingled with the sharper tang of wood smoke. Children laughed in short bursts before darting back toward the warmth, their voices quickly swallowed by the cold air. Inside the shelters, the glow of the firelight painted the walls in soft amber, shadows swaying gently as if the very air had grown drowsy. And so the day ended as it began, not with suddenness, but with slow inevitability, as night reclaimed the land, wrapping it in its deep, still blanket. Outside, the stars emerged one by one, scattered like frost across the sky, while inside the camp, people lay close together, their breathing steady, their dreams perhaps carrying them beyond the frozen world, into warmer, softer places. The Ice Age pressed in on all sides, vast and indifferent. But within this small circle of light and warmth, life endured as it had for countless winters before, and would for countless winters yet to come. From the slow fade of one winter into another, time passed in the ancient world with a rhythm that was almost imperceptible to those who lived it, the seasons turning like a great wheel in the sky, each rotation bringing familiar tasks and familiar comforts. In the heart of a quiet valley, where low hills rose gently on the horizon, and a wide river curled lazily through frost-tipped grasslands, a small settlement thrived, not through conquest or wealth, but through patience, cooperation, and the steady hands of those who knew the land. Morning began with a soft light filtering through thin clouds, bathing the world in a pale gold that made frost sparkle on the branches of leafless trees. In the distance, the faint calls of birds echoed across the valley, carried on air so crisp it seemed to hum with stillness. Men and women emerged slowly from their shelters, cloaked in furs that had been stitched together over many long winters, their movements unhurried, as if the day could wait until they were ready to greet it. Children with sleepy eyes clung to their parents for warmth, their cheeks flushed from the chill, while elders sat by the first rekindled fires, murmuring softly about the weather, the river's behavior, and the signs left in the snow by passing animals. The settlement's shelters formed a loose circle, each made from wooden frames lashed together with sinew, covered in thick hides to keep out the wind. The air within them was warm, carrying the scent of smoke and the faint earthy fragrance of dried herbs hung from the beams. Each morning, the smoke from many small fires rose into the sky, curling upward like delicate ribbons, before dissolving into the pale blue above. Those who were tasked with gathering water would walk the short distance to the river, where a thin crust of ice had to be broken to reach the dark, clear liquid beneath. The sound of it trickling into clay pots was a quiet music of its own, a reminder of the river's constancy, even in the heart of winter. Others tended to animals, dogs that helped with hunting and pulling sleds, stroking their fur and speaking in the low, affectionate tones that soothed both creature and human alike. As the day lengthened, the settlement's life unfolded at a gentle pace. A group of hunters prepared to leave, checking their spears, bows, and packs with quiet focus. Their footsteps left a crisp, orderly trail in the snow as they disappeared toward the forest edge, where the shadows of tall pines stretched long across the white ground. Inside the camp, women worked together to sort dried berries, nuts, and strips of smoked meat, arranging them carefully in woven baskets. The work was rhythmic, almost meditative, each motion a thread in the tapestry of daily life. A few people sat repairing clothing, sliding bone needles through fur and leather with an ease that came from years of repetition, while others shaped new tools from stone, the sharp cracking sound of flint echoing softly across the settlement. Children played in the snow in short bursts, their laughter quickly swallowed by the cold air before they retreated back toward the warmth of the fires. When the hunters returned, the camp shifted into a quiet hum of shared activity. Meat was prepared for drying, bones set aside for tools, and hides stretched carefully to be scraped and treated. The faint smell of cooking began to drift across the settlement, rich and inviting, mingling with the sharper scent of burning pine. As the sun sank lower, casting long streaks of pink and orange across the snow, the people gathered closer to their fires. Stories were told in the fading light, tales of hunts, of the spirits of the land, of ancestors whose wisdom still lingered in the air, like the smoke from their fires. The voices were calm, measured, carrying the weight of generations, but also the comfort of familiarity. At night, the settlement seemed to breathe in unison. The fires burned low, embers glowing softly beneath a light dusting of ash. The wind moved gently through the hides of the shelters, making a faint rustling sound that blended with the occasional crackle of wood. Above, the sky was so clear that every star seemed etched into it, the Milky Way stretching like a pale river from one horizon to the other. Sleep came easily here, wrapped in the warmth of fur blankets and the nearness of a family, the rhythm of the heart, matching the slow rhythm of the world outside. The passing of weeks and months brought change in subtle ways. The river swelled slightly as snow from the hills began to melt, its current carrying small fragments of ice downstream. Birds returned in greater numbers, their calls more insistent, and the first hints of green appeared in the grasslands, pushing through the damp soil with quiet determination. Hunting trips grew longer, the trails leading deeper into forests where the air was rich with the scent of pine and earth. Fishing became easier as the river teemed with life once more, and woven baskets filled quickly with shimmering scales that caught the light like jewels. The elders of the settlement watched all of this with a calm, knowing patience. They had seen many seasons, and they understood that life was not a race, but a long, winding journey, one best traveled with care. They taught the young to respect the land, to take only what was needed, and to leave behind enough for tomorrow. They showed them how to read the patterns in the wind, the flight of birds, the movement of clouds. Evenings were still for storytelling, but as the days warmed, the stories often spilled outside, with groups sitting under the open sky, their voices mingling with the soft chorus of insects and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. One day, as the sun dipped toward the horizon, a group returned from the forest, carrying something unusual, a bundle of smooth, rounded stones, unlike any found near the river. They were heavier, harder, and when struck together, they made a ringing sound. The elders examined them with interest, speculating on their usefulness. Perhaps for grinding grain, perhaps for shaping into new tools. Small discoveries like this wove change slowly into the fabric of daily life, each one a thread connecting the present to an unknown future. In the months that followed, the settlement continued to thrive. The people built new shelters, expanding their circle outward. The central fire became a gathering place where decisions were made and celebrations held. The rhythm of life remained steady, anchored in the cycles of the seasons and the shared work that sustained them. And though no one here spoke of the distant lands beyond the hills or the seas beyond the horizon, the seeds of curiosity were there, quietly waiting, ready to grow when the time was right. For now, the people were content in their valley, under the watchful eyes of the hills, by the ever-flowing river, living in the space between what had been and what was yet to come, their lives as much a part of the land as the stones, the water, and the sky. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the world was wrapped in shadow and frost, soft light would begin to spread from the east, touching first the highest branches, then the hills, then the frozen edges of the river, until at last it reached the settlement. Fires would be coaxed back to life, breaths would mist in the cold air, and the slow, steady wheel of time would turn again, carrying them forward, as it always had, into another day. The seasons, in their endless turning, brought with them a quiet transformation that none in the valley could name, but all could feel. Winters, though still cold, seemed to pass a little faster, as if the sun lingered longer each day before dipping below the hills. The river ran fuller, carrying with it a richer scent of earth and life, and the soil at its banks grew darker, softer, almost eager to be touched. People began to notice that seeds from berries and grasses, scattered carelessly near the settlement, sometimes sprouted in the same place the following year. At first it was little more than a curiosity, something pointed out in passing, a sign perhaps from the spirits. But over time, as the elders watched these plants grow in familiar patterns, an idea began to take root. Not a sudden revelation, but a slow dawning, like the morning light spreading across the valley. They began to place seeds in the earth deliberately, pressing them into the damp soil with the same care they used to cradle an infant. No one expected much from this. They still relied on hunting and gathering, still followed the herds when they moved, but they returned again and again to see if their small efforts had taken hold. To their quiet amazement, green shoots rose where their hands had worked, and in time, those shoots became stalks, heavy with grain. There was something deeply calming in this, knowing that food could come from the same place, year after year, without the chase or the long journey. It did not replace the hunt, but it softened the hunger when game was scarce, and it gave the settlement another rhythm, a planting rhythm, one that matched the turning of the seasons, but held its own gentle beat. Life began to settle into this new balance. Some members of the settlement still ranged far, following deer and wild cattle into the forests, but more began to stay close to the river, tending the small plots of grain, keeping watch over them with a kind of reverence. The work was patient and repetitive, loosening the soil, pulling away weeds, guarding the young plants from birds. It was not as thrilling as the hunt, but it was steady, predictable, and for many, that steadiness felt like a quiet gift. The shelters, once light enough to be dismantled and carried, began to change. People reinforced them with heavier posts, layered the walls with mud mixed into the hides, and made their hearths deeper, their storage pits larger. They were no longer just passing through this place. They were becoming part of it. In the evenings, they still gathered around the central fire, the air rich with the smell of roasting meat and the sweetness of cooked grain. The conversations drifted lazily about the tracks seen near the western hills, about the shape of the clouds and whether they promised rain, about the old days when the camp moved more often, chasing the herds. The river became more than a source of water and fish. It was the settlement's anchor. Children played at its edge, skipping stones across its surface, their laughter carried away on the current. Women washed hides and baskets there, their hands moving in slow, practiced motions, while men repaired nets and traps nearby. At certain times of the year, the river's banks turned gold, with reeds that swayed gently in the breeze, their whispering sound like a lullaby to those who listened. With the longer stays came new crafts. Clay from the river's edge was shaped into pots, first simple and rough, later smoother, more symmetrical, decorated with lines and spirals scratched into their sides. These pots could hold grain, berries, dried meat, things that once would have been carried in woven bags, but now could be kept for many moons. The ability to store food through the lean months was a change as quiet as it was profound. It meant that hunger no longer came as often, and when it did, it was not as sharp. Elders noticed how life's pace had shifted. The hunt still mattered, but it no longer decided the settlement's every movement. The planting and harvesting of grain marked time now, and in between, there was room for other things. Some people began to carve small figurines from bone or stone, animals, human forms, shapes whose meanings were known only to the maker. Others painted simple patterns on flat stones or the walls of the shelters, using pigments made from crushed berries and ochre from the hills. These creations were not for survival, yet they seemed to nourish something just as important: the need to leave a mark, to shape beauty from the materials of the earth. The animals around the settlement began to change too. Dogs had been companions for as long as anyone could remember, but now wild goats and sheep sometimes lingered near the edges of the fields, drawn by the tender shoots of grain. At first they were chased away, but the elders began to wonder, what if, instead of driving them off, they were allowed to stay, even guided into enclosures made of wood and woven branches? These animals could provide meat, milk, hides, and wool without the dangers of the hunt. It was not an easy shift. The animals were wary, and the people had to learn patience. But in time, a few stayed willingly, and the first steps toward herding were taken almost without realizing it. The settlement grew slowly, as those born here chose to remain, building their shelters near their parents, their friends, their fields. Visitors from distant places sometimes arrived, drawn by the rich river and the stories carried on the wind of a people who had found a way to stay in one place without hunger. Some stayed only a season, others never left. With them came new ideas, different ways of weaving baskets, of shaping tools, of cooking grain. The exchange was always gentle, folded into the daily rhythm, like a new verse in an old song. The passing years deepened this way of life. Where once there had been only a circle of hides and wood, there was now a small cluster of sturdy homes, their walls of mud and reed glowing warm in the evening light. The central fire pit had been built up with stones, its smoke rising straight into the sky. Paths worn into the earth connected each home, each storehouse, each field. In the quiet hours after sunset, when the air was heavy with the scent of warm earth and wood smoke, the settlement seemed to hum with a kind of peace, a peace born of knowing that tomorrow's needs were already waiting in the fields, in the stores, in the patient herds grazing nearby. It was in these years that the people began to think not only of surviving, but of shaping the future. Seeds saved from the strongest plants were set aside carefully in baskets lined with leaves, to be planted when the earth warmed again. Small irrigation ditches were dug from the river to the fields, guiding the water gently where it was needed. Children learned the names of the stars, not just for stories, but to mark the seasons, to know when to plant and when to harvest. And though they still told tales of great hunts and distant lands, more often now they spoke of the fields, the herds, the river, their river, and the way life had unfolded here in quiet harmony, in the stillness before dawn, when the fields were covered in a silver mist, and the only sounds were the soft snorts of the animals and the murmur of the river. It was easy to imagine that this life had always been and would always be. The people moved through their days with the slow grace of those who no longer needed to hurry, each step in time with the steady beat of the land itself. And so, as the wheel of the seasons turned, they remained, rooted, enduring, part of the earth they had tamed, and which, in its own way, had tamed them. The years drifted on in a soft, unhurried rhythm, as if the land itself inhaled and exhaled in seasons, the pale greens of spring swelling into the golds of summer, fading into the browns of autumn, and settling into the whites and grays of winter. And in this cycle, the people learned to trust the quiet patterns of the earth, moving through the fields at dawn, when the dew clung to every blade of grass, and the air still carried the cool scent of night, their bare feet sinking gently into the loosened soil, fingers scattering seeds in practiced arcs that seemed almost like fragments of a forgotten dance. And as the sun climbed higher, they would pause to wipe the earth from their palms, to take a slow drink from clay vessels shaped by hands that knew every curve and edge of their own tools, and the days filled with the low hum of work, the soft clatter of stones being cleared from furrows, the swish of woven baskets brushing against knees, while in the evenings the air grew heavy with the scent of baking bread and simmering grains, smoke curling from small hearths into the violet twilight, the shadows of huts stretching long and thin across the packed earth, and children's laughter mingling with the gentle bleating of goats returning from their grazing, their bells chiming in uneven but oddly soothing patterns. And within these small circles of life, there was an unspoken sense that the rhythm of labor and rest, planting and harvest, was the heartbeat that bound them all together, not in any grand story, but in the countless tiny acts of care and repetition that turned mere survival into something quietly enduring. And over time, paths between dwellings became more defined, worn into the soil by years of footsteps, carrying baskets, water, and news from one hearth to another, and gatherings began to take shape, where food was shared not only out of necessity, but out of a growing desire to mark the turning of the seasons, with autumn feasts where long tables, planks laid over stones, were lined with roasted roots, dried berries, flatbreads, and honey drizzled over the first fruits of summer's labor. And in winter, when the nights grew impossibly long, they lit fires high and wide, their light flickering against the low clouds, and told stories that stretched far back before the oldest elder could remember, tales of wandering herds, storms that once covered the land in ice, and the first brave ones who had planted seeds here. And as these nights passed, the telling itself became as important as the truth within the story. For in repeating them, the people felt their place in a chain unbroken, and though the cold gnawed at the edges of the camp, and the winds pressed at the walls, inside the glow there was warmth in more than just the fire. There was the warmth of belonging, of knowing your breath joined the soft chorus of those who had come before and those who would come after, and with the slow passing of years, Other changes crept in almost unnoticed. Strips of dyed cloth, knotted into hair, patterns carved into wooden bowls, small beads shaped from river shells strung into necklaces, perhaps not for any use, but for the quiet joy they brought the wearer. And in these acts, the beginnings of beauty took root, as natural as the grain sprouting from tilled soil. And in the same way, belief too began to stir, not as rules or rigid worship, but as the sense that the sun's path and the moon's slow pull and the rain's arrival were part of something larger, something to be noticed and perhaps thanked. And so, some began to place small offerings, grains, flowers, bits of polished stone, at the base of an old tree, or by a smooth boulder, gestures that felt right, even if no one could say why. And as the seasons repeated, such spots became known places, visited in times of planting and harvest. And so the first threads of ritual wove quietly into daily life, until the people could not quite imagine a year without them. And with each generation, the knowledge of when to plant, when to hunt, when to gather, deepened like the roots of the crops they tended. And though no one called it wisdom, it was carried in every action, in every shared meal, in every story told under the fading glow of an evening fire.